So when I thought about putting together this last panel on the challenges facing, I thought it would be very interesting to put together the editor-in-chief of Pharmaceutical Executive, Lisa Henderson, because she looks more broadly and reports on the industry, with Mike Shih, who is the head of all of business development at Biogen, and has been, a very senior person at other companies like Sanofi and so forth, because they look at it, they have a broad view, but also they look at it from a different perspective. So now, this topic we could go on for 4 or 5 hours, but we won't do that. But I thought we'd do is pick just a couple of areas and really just give your comments in those areas. I think one of the issues I think that both of you thought were evolving issues was this whole issue of digital for patient care and so forth. And so I guess the first question is, from your individual perspectives, what do you think the opportunity or the challenges in that area for companies in the pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah, I think for pharma companies, the point of digital is just to get closer to the patient and the patient journey. So I think that is going to be a huge driver in terms of the suite of offerings that we think about offering to the patient. Because it's not just the therapeutics, it's how is the patient reacting to the therapeutics? What else can you do? What other offerings can you make to them to make their patient journey better? Just by way of example, are there physical rehab tools you can use for someone with multiple sclerosis? Is there some digital tools that can help them so they don't have to necessarily go to a PT facility and something they can do on their own? Things like that, I think, are going to be in the vanguard.
So I think Doug mentioned it briefly, but he didn't have the exact slide. I think he went through the slide about the growth of the digital apps, and Stephen mentioned, with clinical trials, that's where you see a lot of these touch points that you can have with patients, but that's only the beginning of the journey. So there is that whole journey with the care, the outcomes, and then the adherence and that kind of thing. So I just think it's going to continue to grow. There are I don't envy Stephen or any manufacturer trying to pick a vendor. I don't know how you do that because there are so many right now, and they all are have a different way and a different angle, and I think it's probably really difficult to filter through what's the best technology. Not to mention, it has to be FDA regulated. If you're going to use that data, further, it needs to be approved.
Yeah, one other thing I would say is, besides that, there's also, touched on it, there are regional differences.
Yeah.
And one app for the U.S. may not be the best app for China, so you may have to really kind of carve up how you think about digital, but how do you fit that with your global brand? So the other part of digital I think is fascinating, which kind of builds on what Stephen said. It's like the ability to use clinical data or scans or things like that, and how do you incorporate that into the patient care? For example, wearables, right? You've got a cardiac patient. How do you use that data to monitor how they're doing? Things like that.
Some of the digital data benefits just the patient and their care, but others are linked into the data that might be useful for the pharma and biotech companies. Can you talk about that, the ones that are developing, and whether that's really going to be helpful or not?
I think the data is helpful. I think one of the overlying issues, as Steve touched on, was the privacy rules. I think that they vary again from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And then I think, I think the data also has to be tied, frankly, to genetics and translational medicine at the end of the day. So how do you do that with the regulatory schemes that you have in place? It's not very apparent to me. I can marry all those systems and be consistent about it. Because the quality of the data you're getting from Europe versus the quality of the data you can get from China in terms of genomics is very good. In the United States is very, very different. And so how do you account for that?
And the healthcare systems are different, and they're different in China, right? So that affects how that works. Lisa?
I would just say that there's so much data out there, and you have to, I think, either integration it's a major issue. And then, what was I gonna say? It
Well,
went right out of my head. Oh, and choosing the data that you want to, that you need to collect, instead of just throwing it all out there and say, it could be a bit much.
I'm going to step back and take a little big picture, because I was curious how you would answer this question, which is, I'm going to ask each of you, if you were to list the 2 or 3 biggest challenges that you see, and it could be in any area, it could be financial, it could be technology development, whatever, that you see that the biopharma industry facing the next 5, 10 years, what would your list be?
Well, okay, I know we're talking about challenges, but I also want to kind of stand back at the 10,000-foot level and say there's just been remarkable advances in science and in industry. And think about cellular therapy and where gene therapy could go. There's a lot of potential there. So I think one of the critical questions is I think gene therapy is going to happen. I think it's going to be really impactful for a lot of diseases. But where's the line where gene therapy is worth it and where it's not worth it? And that's something society has to work out because it's going to be very expensive. But I think that's going to be a challenge. Like, what does that business model look like? Do you pay for years of outcomes? Do you just pay one shot? And how do you manage all of that? On top of that, I think it's going to take probably 20 years for us to really get it right because there's going to be long-term safety implications.
Well, in fact, one of the big issues is cost. I mean, just because it works doesn't mean it's economic.
Yeah.
Christopher Austin was talking about, say, it costs $1 million, you save someone's life, but it's tough math to say, why should I spend that today, on some basis of amortizing with a person's lifetime.
Yeah, and I think the other global issue is probably just the emergence of other markets, particularly I think China. Just the dollars and sheer force of that economy, and it's something we have to think about in the United States.
And of course, the fact that it's a very predictable government actions and everything is protected, and IP is protected, obviously is a factor. Yeah. Lisa, your list of the key challenges?
So I just want to build on what Michael said and what Christopher spoke about. The huge amount of scientific advances, I don't even know how people keep everything straight with everything. Because even you said, like in the past 30 years, we've gone from here to here. So it just goes, the pace is so fast. The pace of biotech is so fast. How the companies that come around, what they do, I don't know how, again, anyone stays on top of it. But it's rewarding, and every person to a T that I've spoken to or interviewed during the COVID in the space, the most dedicated people on the planet, really, in this room. I just have to say that. But as far as challenges, it's that talent. I think like on another level, it's that HR issue. We've been talking about it. I think like this, what are companies going to look like post-COVID? How are we going to interrelate? How are companies going to manage? It's a major leadership and I think HR challenge. And then factor in your diversity and factor in the remote, and again, I say the talent, but where you're resourcing that talent. So
that's right. I want to follow on. You mentioned China, which would be next on my list. China's really kind of a dilemma, right? Because if it was like Vietnam, you'd say, okay, well, all right, but it's a small market, so whether I succeed or don't succeed there, it's not a big deal. But it's a huge market, but also there are a lot of dilemmas about the Chinese market, both in terms of how it operates, but also competition, et cetera, and so forth. Do you want to elaborate on?
Well, I think the tough decision is the amount of investment you're going to make in China for what kind of products, and because the country is so big, the infrastructure that you have to put in place is got to be big. So you have to have scale to be effective there. I think AstraZeneca has been pretty good at it. And then you overlay on top of that government pricing, that there are the mandated government cuts in pricing, and you really have to make your returns in the first couple of years and be confident that you can do it with that infrastructure. Then as the price goes down, you make less and less profit.
It's like the Japanese.
But what do you do with all that infrastructure that you have? So you kind of keep feeding that beast in a sense once you get to a certain scale, and it's hard to keep up with that.
Lisa, any comments on China as an opportunity or a challenge?
I mean, I think it's a challenge, but I don't see it. It's just going to develop. Right now, most of the issues are the supply chain, and making sure that you have facilities in China or in Asia Pac to get things to where they need to be. And I know that companies are still investing in that. So I still think it's an opportunity.
Yeah. Well, they in 2008, they used to use a phrase about financial institutions, too big to fail.
Yeah.
And the phrase I like to use about China for pharma is it's too big to ignore.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Right? That you have to have a position, whether you like it or not. You have to have some strategy, because it's too big, to ignore.
Yeah. There's also in China. There's also a huge amount of capital coming out of there. There's a lot of company formation going on. So the next wave is actually going to be a lot of Chinese companies doing pretty innovative things. I think it'll be interesting to see how the Chinese government reacts to that in terms of, okay, it's our homegrown company, homegrown market. How do we reward them with it? Traditionally, they just go to the United States and get the money.
That's right. Yeah, speaking of that, in terms of the Chinese biotech industry, as you know, a couple of years ago, the Chinese government mentioned just a small list of industries that they wanted to be the quote leader by 2025. And then, of course, they regretted saying that because then it put a target on everyone's back. But one was biotech, right? So, to what extent should Western pharma and biotech companies worry about Chinese competition or not?
Well, I think you just have to compete. There's no answer. There's nothing you can do except compete. And it's not like you can go in and buy Chinese biotechs. So I think you have to compete on your own.
Do you think they're advancing technology at a rate that's going to be a problem, or is it just their willingness to start things up and get funding?
It's both, and there's also a lot of talent. Like there's a lot of Asian executives who grew up in pharma here. We're going back there to start companies, and there's a whole bunch of people that I know personally who are pretty senior people at big pharma who've gone back and I'm doing I got a ton of money, and for instance, like Lilly Asia Ventures, they've got a lot of money, and people are coming out with like $150 million A rounds for Chinese biotech. So there's a lot of money there.
And that money can't come to the U.S. because of the CFIUS.
Somehow,
right? Because CFIUS, we don't know CFIUS, it's the U.S. It's actually a committee. Actually, my wife was on it for a while when she was in Washington, and they look at any investments or ownerships, direct or indirect, in U.S. companies that might present some kind of threat, right? Yeah. And traditionally, it's been in high tech, but they've been scrutinizing in pharmaceuticals and biotech more and more. So it's made it very difficult for U.S. biotech companies to take money either from Chinese companies or Chinese venture companies. Mm-hmm. Any further comment about China?
No, I would just go to Michael's point that talent and, mostly being here and learning pharma, being in pharma here and being educated in the schools here and going back. It's that whole capitalism, innovation, scientific, drive. It's not just the money, it's like wanting to move the science forward. And I just wonder how that works with their government. That's, I'm not a big political science major, but, I don't how that all goes.
Well, there's a lot going on in China and a lot going on between the U.S. and China. Yeah. That's for sure. And anyone who says that they can exactly predict what's going to happen is
it's that individual, drive.
Yeah.
That innovation.
Yeah.
So that's. Yeah.
Sure. One of the things that we had chatted about before, that was the relationship between biotech and big pharma. And I mentioned a little bit about that when I was going through the biotech and pharma M&A and so forth. But the relationship has changed, right? And will continue to change. Any thoughts about that and how you see that relationship, how it's changed over the last 5-10 years, and where you think it will head, going forward?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the fundamental relationship hasn't changed because, biotechs, valuations have changed, but the fundamentals have changed. Because biotechs need pharma at some point for global distribution because they can't do it. Right? And so if you're going to actually exploit your asset, whether it's through a partnership or an M&A, you're going to need to partner up with someone who can get into those other countries to really maximize their value. And so there's always going to be that relationship. I'm kind of curious about is all these biotechs that are getting snapped up into pharma, do they become innovation hubs within the companies, or do the people just leave and go do another biotech? I suspect it's the latter, but there's always the hope that maybe those things can spur some innovation in big pharma. But the problem with big pharma that I've been in is just decision making and budgeting is so diffuse that sometimes you just lose out because of a priority, because of a budget priority to what innovation gets funded.
Have you seen any pattern or differences in behavior among the big pharma about how they treat biotechs that they acquire in terms of giving them freedom or not giving them freedom?
I think the tendency is give them freedom but realize no one's going to stay.
Oh, I see. Okay.
You give them the freedom in the hope that some people will stay, but you realize they're probably not going to, because there's a reason they joined the biotech in the first place from a cultural standpoint. And you plug them into like a Pfizer, a Sanofi, or J&J, it's a very different field.
So you better buy for the product and technology than the people, because only one of them would stay.
Yeah, maybe the exception is Loxo, right? That management team seems to start about that.
But any comment about the biotech pharma relationship?
So I took over our pharmaceutical executive at the beginning of 2017. So I have to say, biotech became more of a focus of our coverage because you couldn't get away from it. There was just that, because to your point, that's where all the innovation was. And so what's my point? My point is there's a lot of crossover of talent between pharma and biotech. I don't know about how the pharma treats biotech when they buy them, but there's a lot of pharma that has presence in innovation hubs. And I was asking Andy about how that might have changed the whole ecosystem in Cambridge. What was that ecosystem like during COVID? How these interrelationships, cutting edge science, and the pharma being there. That continues, and I've noticed, our emerging pharma leaders that we do,
Right.
There's a lot more PhDs that come out and starting their own companies, just CEO, they start, and they understand, they're going to need a runway. Is that the right terminology? The runway. And
Right.
then they have the different, do we go, we can do an IPO, do we do this, or do we just take it all the way, and then we're going to need to bring in our own commercial people? But to Michael's point, you can't get global commercialization easy without a large partner.
By the way, full disclosure, I've been on the
Yeah, this is true.
I've been on the editorial advisory board of Pharmaceutical Executive for
Before my time.
for maybe 20 years.
Yeah,
something like that, 20 years. But the reason I mention that is I've seen how the relative importance of biotech in your publication has changed over time, right?
Yeah.
Which is a reflection of how the relationship between biotech and pharma, right? Because
I agree.
years ago, when I first said, people would only talk about, Eli Lilly and Pfizer and so forth.
Yeah.
And then over time, there was recognition that the issues for the biotechs and relation biotech with pharma is such that it really has to be part of your editorial, your focus. Yeah,
It was a real positive too, I think.
By the way,
Oh, and I have full
Go
disclosure
ahead.
too. anything I heard today or anything, I'm not writing about it, okay? I mean, I keep it in my mind, but I will not like quote anyone off the record or anything.
Unless it's really,
Yeah.
unless it's really good.
Just a full disclosure. I'm sorry, go ahead, Peter.
But if you want to quote them and we
Yeah.
contact us.
Oh, yeah, that's what
Then I'm sure that'll be fine. By the way, in terms of this relationship, you know, I started my career coming out of our business when I joined Bain & Company when there were 23 people and left when there were 800 people, and all the clients are life science and pharmaceutical. But then I spent 3 years at the oldest venture capital firm, J.H. Whitney, and which is the Whitney family that started in 1946, and they made one of the first biotech investments, was Genetics Institute, and this was a long time ago. And all I remember is the senior partner, Benno Schmidt, he said, you know, I have no idea how this is going to be a business. He said, I know they can invent stuff and they're probably going to invent stuff, but I can't answer the question is how does it become a business, right? Because I don't know how they're going to sell it. I don't know how they're going to make it, and whatever.
That's what they say about digital health.
I mean,
Exactly what they say.
is that right? Yeah.
But
But
he's cool, but I don't know how we're gonna make money off of it.
But he laughed. He laughed because he said, you know, I never make an investment in a company where I can't say, here's how they're going to sell, here's how they make it, whatever. I never do that. So, but I'm going to make an exception here. And it turned out they went through some bumps and so forth because they were trying to figure out how to make it to a business. But it was the right thing to do, right? Yeah. Of course, he also invested in Minute Maid orange juice. You know, when they first started having refrigerators,
Oh, frozen
and they did a
concentrate.
test. You know, the partners sat around and they tested. This guy mixed up the frozen orange juice, and they unanimously said it tasted terrible. But they were going to invest because ultimately, refrigerators and women going to work would mean that they would sell this stuff. So, but they universally said this tastes terrible.
I wonder where that market is now.
Well, now it's gone. It's just
Yeah.
fresh orange juice. Now, one last, I would ask a kind of a funky question in a sense, and not one that we talked about when we got ready for this.
Surprise question.
It's a surprise question, and it actually comes off of what Doug Long saw in the chart he said. And you say, what's the biggest problem for the drug industry? Now you could say, okay, inventing, regulatory, whatever. But I looked at his chart where he showed where the healthcare costs are really getting chewed up, and it's hospital services, right? So the world has a finite set of dollars, right? And the healthcare costs in this country have escalated so much that it's really hurt the competitiveness of the U.S. Right? I mean, if you compare the healthcare costs in the U.S. versus other, it's a huge part of the cost, and it really hurts, right? Because it's not just how much you pay someone per hour; it's all the other stuff that comes with it, you know, the insurance, so forth. So, to what extent will the industry face is the ongoing escalation of hospital costs a bigger enemy than the other things, or not? And should the pharmaceutical industry do anything about it, or is it even politically acceptable to do anything about it? So this is a good surprise question, right?
Well, you don't go and attack your customers, so it's probably not going to come from us as an industry. Hospitals and doctors and nurses for the pharmaceutical industry to attack, you know, how they spend their money or the choices they make. That's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. But do you agree with the general principle?
Well, the data is the data. You know, I was kind of shocked that it was that high relative to everything else. But I don't know. You could maybe even draw it back to be honest, is it based on tort reform? Because frankly, they have to run all these tests to protect themselves from liability of getting sued. And do you start with tort reform and go back from there? But the trial lawyers are a really powerful lobby, and that's probably why it's the real attraction. But you think about it, if you had tort reform, in theory, you could bring down insurance costs. If you brought down insurance costs and took, you know, some risk of liability, maybe the doctors would only run the test that they actually really needed to run. And you could cut some, at least that, or I think diagnostics, you ever look at your bill from your doctor, the visits like this and then all the blood tests and everything, that's big. It's a big cost.
Yeah.
And
And,
just why Elizabeth Holmes started.
and insurance, doctors, the insurance they pay is just astronomical.
Exactly.
Lisa?
I don't think, I mean, pharma's got its, and when I say pharma, I mean pharma.org, that they've got their plan and their goal, and that's what I don't think they're gonna go outside of that and like I said, attack anybody, but I mean, maybe more education, which they, they're constantly putting out there, we're only so much, a small percentage of the
indirect,
overall, right, it isn't we're the small percentage of the overall healthcare spend. We actually do produce drugs that can keep you out of the hospital system, keep people healthier longer, not have to, take. But I don't think they're going to actually do anything. But we have a really strong role. But it's
And they're doing a lot of the same positive things. Just
Yeah.
like the plastics industry said, okay, you hate us, but think about all of the benefits of your everyday life. So similar. And what I'll do with the last couple minutes, I want to ask if anyone in the audience would like to ask either
We
Lisa.
also should say, by the way, PBF are getting off scot-free.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We can throw them under the bus.
Tell me what value they create for the system commensurate to the value they get from the rebates.
Yeah. No, it's true.
It's not true. They don't create strength.
Yeah, that's right. They have a good story, but they don't. Right?
Yeah.
Any questions from the audience that anyone would like to ask?
I think there are just two maybe comments or questions. The hospital cost, the question is the hospital cost, administrative cost of hospitals have gone up dramatically. The CEOs sometimes ignore that apart. So the question is, their cost increase is what? It's their administrative cost, not the cost of the patient, actually. It's very interesting to look at that. Because if you look at all these regional hospitals, what's going on with them, their CEOs make a humongous amount of money right now. And I still remember when I grew up in Buffalo. The Sisters of Charity, there's a big system there, right? They had enormous money running those hospitals. Now they have humongous administrative organizations, huge, bigger than a pharma company. So that was my one point. The second part, I think, as you pointed out on NIH, I've been in onco business for a very long time. Still, radiation and chemotherapy treats most of the patients. So I keep asking myself, all these new drugs keep coming out. You still treat most of the patients with what? Standard of care. Pancreatic, which is we are involved in pancreatic cancer, and still no drug in 14 years. 19 trials have failed in the last 5 years. I'm keeping my fingers crossed. Our trial is supposed to be done next month. We are number 20 in stage 4 study. So I keep asking myself, where is this science actually? Where is it? I mean, we still use radiation for local, locally advanced cancers, pancreatic, biliary, all that. And we still using standard of care. Falciparum stem cell vaccine. So I keep asking, where is this innovation? Where is it going? Actually, it's a little bit what you go.
Yeah, sure.
Well, 80% of people who have solid tumors don't respond to those new checkpoints.
Exactly.
I mean, it depends on at what point you start the treatment.
Yeah.
Detect the tumor, start the treatment. It's a very dynamic process.
Right. And there are no biomarkers in pancreatic cancer either. People are fighting for a long time and there are no biomarkers either. You don't know. You don't even know who to treat, actually. It's all your worst studies. I guess those two questions from your pharma exec that you or as you're looking at what do you see?
Look, standard of care, to be honest, overall, for the American healthcare system isn't that bad. Like, actually, if you look at like type 2 diabetes, if you actually stayed on your medicine, I think Doug always talks about this, you'd actually have diabetes control, you wouldn't have these uncontrolled diabetics.
Mm-hmm.
People just stick to the medication. Now, look, I think in terms of cancer therapies, we're going to get better and better as the genetics get better and better. And I think that's where things are going, and that's where I think the innovation is going. Great point about checkpoints, right? There's a lot of cold tumors that have not been turned hot yet, and that's what people are looking for. But if you think about where we were 10 years ago with no PD-1s, it's kind of remarkable. Because you don't get that that survival curve with anything, except, maybe where you totally bleeded the marrow and had a transplant, et cetera, et cetera. Then in terms of the hospital, I don't know. I suspect there's a lot of stuff going on, and they do it because they can get away with it.
Yes.
So I honestly don't know who's going to hold them accountable.